Good afternoon, everybody. Before we do begin, I'd like to acknowledge that wherever we are coming to and joining together on the lands of traditional custodians, Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'm coming to you from Canberra, which is Ngunnawal land, and I want to pay respects to elders past, present, emerging, and to acknowledge the ongoing contribution that they play in the life of the city and in this nation. Today, we are lucky to be joined by Georgie Dent from the Parenthood. It's National Families Week, and Georgie's here with us today to talk about what families need in response to some research that has been driven by the Parenthood. For children to thrive and to feel happy, healthy and productive and to live these lives, they need support, and so do their parents and their carers. And we know on this that Australia often lags behind. We know that pursuing best practice, evidence-based policies that support parents and children will deliver improved child development outcomes, reduce inequity, and drive significant economic growth. And yet we also know that this is happening much too slowly for our kids and our families and our country. Georgie Dent, journalist, author, former lawyer and leading advocate for women's empowerment, gender equity and families, will be known to most of our audience. Georgie is also the Executive Director of the Parenthood, a not-for-profit advocacy organisation and a contributing editor of Women's Agenda. She's a regular commentator in all forms of media and a very strong voice for women and families in particular, and a very dear friend of Eracy. She's also a very active member of the Minderoo Thrive by 5 campaign, and is making a significant difference to the lives of children and their families. Last week's budget has shown how effective both the campaign and Georgie's advocacy has been, and it's a real pleasure to have you with us today, Georgie, and I can't wait to hear what you've got to tell us. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Penny, for that very kind introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. Now, I have got my slideshow up, but I'm also just wondering, I'm hoping that you can also see me just for this introduction, but
yeah, we can see you and your slides, Georgie. It's great.
Okay, perfect. That's great. No, only just because I feel yes. Okay, good. So my name is Georgie Dent. As Penny said, I'm the Executive Director of the Parenthood, which is a not-for-profit organisation representing parents, carers and supporters around the country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all meeting. And for me here in Sydney, that is the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Now, a little bit about me. I am, aside from being all of the different slash titles that Penny introduced me as, I am also a mother of 3 girls. My daughters are aged from 11 to 5. And so I think it is fair enough to say that while I had a professional interest in the subject of families and women and children and creating good outcomes for families, but I also do have a personal connection, I suppose, to working in this space. I was a lawyer very, very briefly before becoming a business journalist at BRW magazine in 2008. And really, when I got to BRW magazine, I became very fascinated by the subject of women and gender equality in Australia. I was very fortunate and naive enough to grow up genuinely believing that gender equality was sorted. You know, at university, I certainly knew that there were more girls than boys than there were in all of my lectures. But arriving in the workplace sort of shattered the illusion I had that gender equality was already sorted. And so it was back then, well before I had any children, that I did become really fascinated by the structures and systems that we have in Australia that make it more difficult for women to participate in paid work in the same way that men do. And really, it's because of my work as a journalist, writing on subjects like sexism and sexual harassment, but also policy issues like paid parental leave and access to high quality, affordable early education and care, that I have got myself into a position when last year in July, the board of the Parenthood invited me to take over as executive director, and I enthusiastically accepted that position. I had been on the board of the organisation for about 15 months prior to that, and I had always been a sort of passionate supporter of the work of the Parenthood. As a journalist working for Marie Claire magazine, for Mamma Mia, for Women's Agenda, I was a columnist in the Sydney Morning Herald for about 3 years, and I often turned to the Parenthood for research and for case studies on families to sort of put a face to some of the issues that I was writing about. So that's just a little bit of a longer introduction to me, I suppose, to kind of give you the background to how I came to have the job that I do. Now, the Parenthood, as I've said, it is an inclusive, not-for-profit organisation that seeks to give voice to parents, carers and families. Our mission is to work together to make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent, because we believe that when parents are supported, children can thrive and our whole community will be stronger. We launched in 2013, and with the support of long-term partners and collaborators, we have built a community of over 72,000 mums and dads and grandparents and supporters and allies in every state and territory around the country. Since 2013, we have tried to, and I think we have fairly successfully secured a seat at the table for parents to have a say in and on key debates in the media and in political forums. We have sought to empower our members to use their voices on issues that are central to families across the country. We believe that parents are major stakeholders in the future of Australia, but they lack a powerful collective voice. And that's where we believe we can be of help, because a parent voice that is well organised and resourced is a parent voice that can be heard. And a parent voice that can be heard remains one of the strongest and most effective means of influencing and driving positive policy outcomes for Australian parents, families and their children. As I said, I've been the organisation's executive director since July last year. And for the 15 months prior to that, I was on the board. And it was during that period on the board that we actually undertook a strategic review of the Parenthood's motivation and mission and method in 2019. And it was during that process that we, as a board, conceived a research report to support the mission that we had landed on to make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent. Now, we had an idea of what that might entail. The kinds of policies and practices that would be required to make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent. But we knew that we needed more than an inkling. We needed a really solid evidence base to form a roadmap to making Australia the best place in the world to be a parent. So we set out to create a unifying piece of research that uncovered the full experience of parents in the early years, the impact of good and bad policy on families and children and the economy. And we wanted to examine the link between parenting supports and child outcomes and establish where Australia sits in the international landscape of best practice for parenting supports. To undertake this piece of research, we partnered with Equity Economics, and I think it is relevant to say that they are a leading female-founded and female-led economics firm that specialises in original research. We couldn't think of a better team to work with to bring this particular piece of work to life. And so really, in a nutshell, the question that we wanted to ask were, what does best practice support for parents look like? Where does the international community stand on those best practices? And how do they affect parent and child outcomes? And obviously layering that into the experience in Australia. And what we found was pretty compelling. And we found that Australian parents are being left behind when it comes to having access to the support they need to help their children thrive. Now, we know, and I know that I'm speaking to the converted here today when I say that parenting matters. In raising children, parents quite literally have the future in their hands. We know that by the age of 5, 90% of a child's brain is fully developed. We know that what happens in the early years of a child's life is richly formative. We know, in part because of the terrific work that Eracy undertakes, that children fare best when they are well nourished, when they are responsibly cared for, when they have access to learning opportunities from birth onwards, and when they are protected from disease, violence, and stress. Now, we know that with very few exceptions, every parent wants to raise healthy, thriving children and to give their child the best start in life. But we also know that parents need support, they need resources, and they need time to provide that nurturing care, particularly in the early years when the pressure and the stakes are often the highest. Having a baby is simultaneously joyous, wonderful, and terrifying. Even with immense privilege, having a baby is a time of great upheaval. The responsibility is overwhelming, and for new mums in Australia, it is often a time of incredible isolation. That beautiful African proverb that it takes a village to raise a child is profound because it is so apt. We should not expect anyone to undertake the raising of a child as a solitary exercise that any parent can undertake without help. The reality is, to thrive, all children and all parents need support. Now, the level of support different cohorts of parents and children need to thrive varies. But we know that in 2021, across the breadth and depth of Australia, children and parents actually need more support than ever before. We know that the pandemic upended life as we knew it, and we know that for children, parents and families, it didn't just exacerbate existing pressures, it triggered new stresses, and it created new, previously unimaginable problems. Across Australia, families have been handling issues big and small while trying to fulfil their responsibilities as carers. From sudden job losses to homeschooling, to working from home, to lockdowns, to desperately trying to keep businesses afloat. From managing the physical and emotional needs of little people confined in their homes, being separated from loved ones, being unable to access all of the usual emotional and physical support. The difficulties presented in 2020 for families and children were relentless. And it is no surprise that parental distress is at an alarming rate as a result. Despite this, we do still remain constrained by the perception that parenting is a luxury, that's something that individual parents alone can and should undertake without any assistance. But parenting is essential, and the ramifications of supporting or failing to support parents are considerable. That suicide is the leading cause of maternal death in Australia is catastrophic. That a 2020 UNICEF report analysing child wellbeing ranked 32nd among 41 OECD and EU countries and found that we fall short in delivering consistently good health, education and social outcomes for children is catastrophic. The physical and mental wellbeing of children and parents was tested before 2020, but we know very definitively that 2020 has compromised it further. To quote Richard Weston, who was until very recently the CEO of Snake, to have strong, healthy children, you need strong, healthy parents. And to have strong, healthy parents, you need to have strong, healthy families, you need strong, healthy parents. And what we know is that we are making it very difficult for parents to be the strong, healthy supports that their children need. So what our research shows is that compared to international best practice, Australian parents and children are being let down. We lag developed countries in the provision of best practice evidence-based policies that support families and children, and we lack a unified approach to such policies and practices. We know that this fails to deliver optimal outcomes for children, parents, society, and the economy. The flip side to that is that getting these policies right presents an incredibly compelling social and economic case for reform. So a couple of the areas that we looked at include paid parental leave. Now, for mothers in the OECD, the average paid leave available is 50 weeks. In Australia, the average is 18 weeks. And when you look here on the slide, if you look at the length of time versus the pale blue, which is the full rate equivalent, in terms of full rate equivalent, Australian mothers have access to roughly 7 weeks. So it is one of the least adequate paid parental leave schemes in the OECD. So you'll notice here that the United States is the only country that offers less paid parental leave than Australia does. We know that globally, fathers in Australia take less than 20% of the paid leave that fathers take internationally. So we have a situation where upon the arrival of a baby, virtually every family is going to experience a significant decline in their income, which obviously presents degrees of financial stress. Now, we know that the benefits of offering paid parental leave are really significant. They are significant in terms of health outcomes for children, as well as bonding with parents, as well as parental engagement with mothers, mental health in particular. And so Australian families from the very, very beginning are put on a track where it is difficult, it is more difficult than it needs to be to adjust to the transition from adult to parent. We looked at early education and care in Australia, and we saw quite clearly that when it comes to participation levels in early education and care, Australian children lag behind. In the ages of 3 and 4, we lag the OECD average for participation. Now, what is also problematic is that we know that the children in Australia who are the least likely to attend early education are the same children who stand to benefit the most from participating. And that is an issue that we have in part because the cost of early education and care is so significant. We did see that in 2020, when the federal government introduced the temporary period of fee-free childcare for parents, a lot of services reported that they had an influx of children from disadvantaged social backgrounds attending in higher numbers than previously. And what this indicated is that a lot of the families who suddenly started sending their children to care, one of the things that was interesting was that a lot of those families would have been eligible for highly subsidised early education and care in any case. In most cases, it would be very nearly free, at least a couple of days a week. But we know that the barriers to children participating in early education are not just limited to cost. But we do know that on the issue of cost, parents in Australia are paying some of the highest out-of-pocket fees in the world. And we know that that is also a reason why participation rates among 3 and 4-year-olds are significantly behind other nations. When it comes to parental health and well-being, the picture, as I alluded to earlier, is distressing. So we know that 20% of mothers experience depression and anxiety in the perinatal period, and we know that that has adverse outcomes for children. We know that 10% of fathers experience depression and/or anxiety in the perinatal period. We know that 20% of fathers report feeling isolated, totally isolated in the first year of parenthood, and 38% worry about their mental health. There is a scarcity of data on the experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents, but we know that for the general population, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population are 2.6 times more likely to experience higher levels of psychological distress, and they're almost twice as likely to die by suicide. It's important, I think, that we don't look at any of these issues in isolation. We have to look at the way this fits together. We know that paid parental leave, for example, sets up the pattern for caring and sets up the expectations inside the home and outside the home for who cares and how that caring happens. And when I look at these figures around that indicate how compromised the health and well-being of so many parents in Australia is, I think it makes it really important and more important for us to examine the structural causes of these and start to ask the questions that if we've got parents who are feeling this isolated, what are the types of policies and supports and practices that we could pursue to improve that? And we do know that increasing paid parental leave, having adequate paid parental leave and having it equitably shared, so creating that expectation and support for parents, mums and dads, to take time off when a baby arrives is one of the most important policy levers that we have at our discretion. We know that workplace practices in Australia make it more difficult for parents to participate and progress in their careers than non-parents. We know that for mothers in particular in Australia, there is a very significant penalty attached to being a mum. We know that fathers, after the arrival of a baby, are more likely to work more and earn more than ever before. After the arrival of a baby, mothers in Australia tend to reduce their work and rarely, if ever, return to their pre-children work skills. And obviously that has really significant impacts for their earning ability over the course of their lives. We know that that discrimination is very high. We know that pregnancy discrimination is the #1 workplace complaint, with 1 in 2 mothers reporting discrimination. Now, as we know with any form of discrimination, what is being reported is not necessarily the full experience. So if we've got 1 in 2 mothers reporting experiencing discrimination in the workplace, I think it's pretty safe to say that this is a prolific issue. We also know that for lots of fathers who do request flexible work arrangements or do request having extended paid parental leave or unpaid leave to look after children, they face discrimination as well. There is an adverse consequence for men trying to be actively engaged in the caring of children and on the home front. We know that in Australia, we remain very wedded to traditional ideas. The fact that 1 in 5 Australians agree with the statement that when a mother works for pay, the children suffer is pretty telling. And again, when I look at these figures, I encourage people to look at the big picture and think, we know that when a woman doesn't work and doesn't have income, she becomes much more financially precarious in the short term, but it's compounded over the long term. And that has an impact on children, because children and mothers, we know, are very closely related, and there is a great correlation between their outcomes. So it's why the issue of women's workforce participation cannot just be viewed as mothers seeking a financial reward just purely for themselves. We know that when a woman earns money and the family income increases, we know that the financial stress is limited, and we know that that has a positive impact on children. So we asked Equity Economics to look into what would the best practice policies and supports for families look like. And what they presented, we think, presents a really compelling blueprint for a national parenting strategy that would increase child wellbeing as well as parental health and wellbeing, and generate significant economic returns. So Equity Economics have concluded that the best practice for paid parental leave is 1 year of paid leave that is equally shared between 2 parents. They found that free and high quality early childhood education and care is the best practice for children from 0 to 5. Ensuring that parents have access to quality health and psychological health care during the perinatal period is essential. And we also know that flexibility in the workplace for parents and carers makes a huge difference. So we know that providing families with up to 12 months of paid parental leave at full pay would lead to an increase in GDP due to higher female participation and productivity due to less time out of the labour market. That would amount to about $116 billion or 2.9% by 2050. We know that it would cost an additional $7.6 billion per year in 2021, increasing to $10.2 billion per year in 2050. We know that the additional paid parental leave would lead to an increase in breastfeeding rates by 4.6% and an associated increase in labour productivity. We do specifically note in the research that while breastfeeding is absolutely not always possible and fed is best, it is undeniable that there are a whole lot of health benefits that flow from facilitating breastfeeding. And we know that paid parental leave is one of the key ways that you can facilitate breastfeeding, particularly in the first 6 months of a child's life. We know that the social benefits, are significant aside from the economic benefits that would flow from having a more equitable and more adequate paid parental leave scheme. So Australia's current scheme offers 18 weeks at the minimum wage. We know that less than half of the bigger employers in Australia offer any additional paid parental leave, which is why we see the average that a parent is entitled to is just 18 weeks at the minimum wage. Our current scheme was introduced 10 years ago, and it was introduced as a starting point. It was welcome, and actually even back then, Australia lagged the OECD countries in not having a statutory paid parental leave program until that point. When it was brought in, the idea was that it would be built upon by government and the private sector, both coming to the table to recognise the need for additional paid parental leave. And with the exception of a few sort of tweaks around the edges around dad and partner pay, we have not had any substantial expansion in paid parental leave in the last decade. And parents are paying a significant price for that, and so are their children. We know that providing free and high quality early childhood education and care to all children would represent international best practice. The benefits in terms of child development outcomes and increased participation among parents in paid work delivers a sustainable source of economic growth. Now, what this research shows is that the early education and care has to be high quality. For early education and care to be high quality, early educators and teachers and carers have to be remunerated fairly. They have to be employed securely. At this point, those things are not happening. We know that the provision of free, high quality early education and care would lift future productivity of children and participation of women in the labour market. The lift could increase $2.15 billion to GDP by 2050. That's from the child development outcomes. It could also lift GDP by up to $47.2 billion by 2050 when you take into account the increase in female workforce participation. The cost would be $9.6 billion per year, rising to $13.2 billion a year in 2050. And while that is not an insignificant cost, when you compare that to the benefit that it would deliver economically and socially, I think you would be hard pressed to find a better reform to pursue, which is why, as Penny said, the Parenthood is involved with the Thrive by 5 campaign, and we are an enthusiastic supporter of the push for universal access to high quality early education and care. We know that women's workforce participation in Australia lags significantly. So we currently rank #1 in the world for female educational attainment, and we rank 70th in the world for female workforce participation. Now, in other countries, those two measures tend to track together, so that if a country is educating females particularly well, their workforce participation is usually improved. We have had this strange situation now for the last 15 years, and one of the explanations that is very widely understood is that because early education and care in Australia is so expensive, and because of the way the early education fees work with our taxation system, there is a very significant disincentive for females in particular to work beyond 3 days a week. We know that addressing this is a really significant component of making every single woman in Australia safe and secure. Women's economic security cannot be separated from women's safety. And so quite apart from the direct benefit for children of getting early education and care right, it is really significant. It is a significant reform that is needed to improve the safety of women in Australia. We have got, so what the report concluded was for the gold standard of care is for all Australian mothers to have universal access to mental health support, using ongoing access to screening, telehealth, group prenatal care, and care continuity during pregnancy. These additional investments would deliver long-term dividends through improved maternal, mental and physical health, reducing rates of low birth weight babies and lower rates of stillbirth. So on this this measure, obviously the return is less significant, but in terms of its significance in the well-being of parents and of children, it is a really significant policy. We see that around the world, when mothers in particular have access to high quality healthcare, and particularly with regard to their mental health, we know that parents and children benefit from that. We know that making sure parents have access to workplaces in which parenting is valued, we need to strengthen the basic workplace relation entitlements that are available in individual workplaces. So while employees covered by the national employment standards have access to paid carers leave and the right to request flexible work, over 25% of employees have no such access in Australia. So the report makes quite clear that getting the paid parental leave policy and early education and care settings right creates a culture in which parents, not just mothers, are supported to raise their children and to combine their paid work with their caring responsibilities. Now, our view, and the research indicates this, that those sorts of policy changes will lead to a cultural shift inside workplaces as a result. But what we also know is that legislating for things like paid carers leave and the right to request flexible work are really paramount and fundamental objectives to pursue. So that is where I was going to stop my sort of brief presentation on our findings. And I know that Penny and I are now going to have a chat, and I'm really happy to take any questions and dive into any of this further. Have I lost people?
No, I'm here. Sorry, Georgie. We were just fiddling with our technology. Thank you for that. That's
fine. I was sorry. I thought I'd done something wrong and pressed a button that had gone wrong.
No, technology at our end. We're working through it. Fascinating, Georgie. Thank you so much. It's delightful to hear all of that. And I think for me, the thing that I didn't know that I'm going to take away from this is, did you say first in educational attainment for women and 70th for workforce participation? Have I got those numbers right?
Yes, sadly you do. And so that's the World Economic Forum has produced what it calls a global gender gap index. It started in 2006. So 15 years ago, it produced the first index. And in that index, Australia was, so that what they do is they measure the gap between men and women in different countries on 4 measures. And the measures are health, political representation, workforce participation, and educational attainment. And each year, every country gets given a ranking on each of those 4 measures, as well as an overall ranking. Now, since 2006, Australia has held the #1 ranking for female attainment of education. But we have steadily declined. And this year, actually, so the 2021 index was only published at the end of March, and 70th is the lowest rating we've ever had for workforce participation. It has previously been around the sort of 40 mark, but which is still very unusual. And it is also in 2006, so 15 years ago, we did rank 15th out of, it was about 153 countries then, whereas we now rank 50th overall. Out of about 225 countries. And so I think that's one of the sort of, that's just the data. And it makes very clear that when we talk about women in Australia working differently to women around the world, it is really compelling that there's a variety of policy settings and structures that we have that mean women are not participating in paid work to the same extent that men do, in a way that is peculiar to Australia.
Look, I'm blown away, Georgie, to be honest. As I said, I didn't know that particular statistic, and I feel so challenged by that on a variety of levels. So thank you for challenging me today with that one and thinking about what I guess at the structural levels that we've been talking about that we can actually do in our advocacy to address that, because yeah, fundamentally a real problem for Australia, not just now, but I think in the long term for us as a nation around all sorts of aspects to do with our economic growth and all of those things as well. So yeah, amazing. We've got a few questions that are sort of coming in. Some largely people are really keen to see whether we can share your slides. We hadn't cleared that with you beforehand, but just really enthusiastic about the content and wanting to know whether they can access that material.
Yes, absolutely. And I actually will post, I've got a hard copy of this beautiful piece of research here, but I will also pop a link in the chat that can hopefully be shared with people on our website. We've actually got quite a few user-friendly summaries of some of this research, which I think is really useful.
And when we put the video of today's recording up on our website, we'll make sure we put the slides and a direct link to your report as well, so that everyone can get it all in one package.
Yeah, perfect.
One of the things that I just want to turn to now, we've sort of got some questions around this, and it was on my list of things that I was really keen to talk to you about. You talked a lot about wellbeing in your report, and obviously something we feel really strongly about here at Eracy, and particularly that link between parents' wellbeing and the wellbeing of their children, as you've sort of pointed out, incredibly evidence-based, and the link to mental health, obviously. And one of the things that we find a lot in the conversations that we have is a interchangeability of mental health and wellbeing, and we would argue that they're not in fact the same things, but they are deeply, deeply linked. I guess one of the comments that we're seeing through the questions here is, this is a no-brainer. Why, knowing everything that we know, all of the reports that, or the information you've just presented, the things that people like me and my colleagues who've been advocating for child wellbeing have been writing about for a long time, why are we not getting any traction on this? What do you think is the barrier? Is the wellbeing language itself a barrier? Why are we not creating a response amongst the political classes to actually do something different in this country?
It's a really good question, and it's something that I've thought about quite a lot, because I suppose when I looked into, there were a couple of bits and pieces that as this research was sort of coming together, that really stopped me in my tracks. And I think that suicide being the leading cause of maternal death in Australia was something that really shocked me. I was also really genuinely shocked by the UNICEF report last year that ranked Australia 32nd out of 41 OECD EU countries for child wellbeing. And my sense is that we are a country that genuinely believes we are a fantastic place to live. And in lots of ways, we are a fantastic place to live. You know, there's no doubt about that on some level. But also, we can't argue with some of these. We can't argue with this research and with this evidence that we've got, that actually it's really easy to say we support children and we want every child to have the best start to life. But if we're not willing to step back and then look at, well, what are the systems that we need so that we are coming good on that promise? Because saying that you want to take care of children is one thing, but actually taking the steps required to deliver better outcomes is another thing altogether. And I think that a little bit in the way that you were sort of, shocked then when I talk about those female workforce participation numbers, I think there are lots of people in Australia who would be genuinely horrified and probably disbelieving of some of these issues. I mean, the other thing that is relevant that I sort of mentioned a little bit is that, we know that the research on the failure to intervene early, so failing to provide the requisite early support to children and families, costs us $11 billion annually. And I think that, again, is not well understood, that when we have conversations about different policies that are necessary. So, for example, if we do talk about universal access to high quality early education and care, we know that part of the rationale for investing in this is because we will be saving money in the long run. We will be able to improve that outcome. But I think that the minute we talk about expanding services expanding a policy or doing things differently, people immediately just think, oh, well, what's the cost? We can't afford that, without actually looking, what are we currently paying for a system that isn't working that effectively? This is one of my frustrations. After the budget was handed down last week, and we knew ahead of the budget that the federal government had flagged an additional $1.7 billion for the childcare subsidy. But what we now know is that $1.7 billion is actually allocated over, the budget says 5 years, but if we're generous to the government, we'll say 3 years. So we're looking at sort of $560 million a year on the childcare subsidy. When you consider that we already spend $10.6 billion annually on the childcare subsidy, an extra $500 million is literally not going to touch the sides. And yet, by making that announcement, we create the impression that we're doing something useful here. I'm really interested in looking at the efficiency of the government spend as well as the outcomes, and I think that is the approach that we need to have when we are talking about the well-being of parents and children. And I take your point completely that well-being is a funny word, and I use it a little bit interchangeably in terms of the mental health and the well-being of parents. But I think that we have to be really we have to spell out what we are talking about, that when we are talking about well-being and mental health being compromised, we are talking about things like an unacceptable rate of suicide, as the leading cause of maternal death. We need to talk about the fact that we are being called out as falling short in delivering consistently good outcomes to children. And we're not being called out by, one organisation that's sitting in the middle of the country. It's UNICEF. And then it's global research. It's the same with the World Economic Forum. Not that I am a small, tiny organisation of 2 people, and I think that I am competent to say these sorts of things, but I think we have to be really realistic about the picture that we've got for children and families in this country in this moment.
I completely agree with you, and I think that's one of the reasons why the work that we do here at Eracy is grounded in that NEST wellbeing framework that says, essentially you have to be valued, loved and safe. You have to have the material basics, healthy, learning, participating with our positive sense of identity and culture, because we know that, you know, all of those aspects, and, you know, the work's obviously not conducted with adults, but, you know, it is probably a level of transferability to parents about having all of those aspects of their own well-being in place. And I think what the report that you guys have generated actually shows is, in fact, actually the same thing that we see with children, is that when you are deprived in one of those domains, it actually has flow-on effects and deprives you across many, and if not all of them. So really interesting parallels. We've got a lot of questions here about getting involved, Georgie, at various levels. So lots of people keen to understand how to become part of the work that Parenthood is doing, wanting to understand, you know, how people at grassroots community level can get behind, I guess, the work that you're doing, the Thrive by 5 work as well. What would you suggest for just ordinary grandparents, parents? How can we get people involved?
Yeah, well, look, that is music to my ears, because really we are a grassroots organisation, and we really just want to have as many allies, carers, supporters, grandparents. You know, we all are welcome to really join our community, and it's free to join. You can go to theparenthood.org.au and you can join our list. You can follow us on Facebook. We are in the process of developing a few campaigns, just because, you know, our sense is, and really our research, I suppose, has framed this, that we want to make sure that these issues are on the national agenda, because we are really, really confident that if we got a couple of these reforms happening, we would make a really significant positive impact in the lives of children and families. And so I would say that to sort of get behind, look us up and follow the work that we do. We're often calling out for families, or you know, we get a lot of requests from the media asking for particular families to talk to certain issues, which I think is fantastic, because we need to be able to put a face to these issues. And so sort of being a part of our network means that, you know, when I get those calls, or when we get those calls, we can help put families in touch with journalists, which I know is not something that everybody would be interested in doing, but we're always so grateful for our members who are willing to do that, because we are, you know, as I sort of said at the beginning, the Parenthood, we really believe that a parent voice that is well organised is capable of being very effective. And I would like that voice to be as diverse as parents are in Australia. And so we are always seeking to increase our membership so that we do reflect the parent population in Australia, and carer population as well.
Fantastic. I've got 2 more quick ones. Well, maybe we'll see how quick they are. I know that we've got a really big group of early years educators who have joined us on the webinar today, and wanted to give a big shout out to them and to the amazing work that they do. You touched briefly on the issues of the ECEC workforce during your presentation. Given that we've got an educator cohort listening to us today, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Look, I am incredibly grateful for the early educators that we have in this country. I know on a personal level that in every early learning setting that any of our children have been in, the thing that has made it a positive experience has been the educators and the carers. And I think that I am as fueled by wanting that work to be valued and recognised and remunerated appropriately as I am fueled by the desire for all families and all children to have access to high quality early learning services. I think that I know that there can be this sort of misunderstanding that if we're asking for free, then we're expecting educators to do that for free. And in my mind, it's sort of the complete opposite to that, that this work is so incredibly valuable that every child needs access to it. But to set up a robust early education system, early learning and childhood education and care system, we need to create the employment conditions that make it a secure career path. We know at the moment, I mean, you know, my sense from so many different groups that I'm involved in is that at the moment the shortages across the board around Australia in different services is really concerning. We know that early educators are leaving because we know that the remuneration does not align with the value of the work that is being done. We know that too often, and we saw this last year with the fee-free period for childcare fees, we saw that for a lot of services that put a lot of pressure on them, and that JobKeeper didn't work for a lot of early educators because there's so much casual employment in the sector, and the casualisation of work is another contributing factor that means people leave because it's not secure. And I mean, last year I said a few times that, you know, when primary schools and high schools were coming to grips with COVID, as we all were, no teacher for 2 minutes had to worry that their employment would be lost or that schools would be shut down. Every single teacher had to be very concerned with how are we going to deliver education to these children? What is that going to look like in the pandemic world? There were a whole lot of logistical challenges, and I'm not downplaying those. I think they were significant. But what those teachers didn't have to worry about on top of that adjustment was, will I have a job? Will schools remain open? The fact that early educators did not have that luxury, they had the exact opposite, I think really highlighted the problem that we have, because we should have an early education system that is robust enough that at the very least it gives the educators stability and security. Because how can we deliver, you know, early education is fantastic at giving children continuity and stability and security. And if we don't give that to the educators, then the children have no hope of having that stability and security. So I guess that would be my point, that I don't see these as either or. I think that parents are huge allies and supporters of early educators. And I want to make this change happen for both, you know, for positive outcomes for children as well as early educators.
Couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely, well said. And our last question, probably the last one we have time for. Can you call out any really good examples of this, where we're actually doing this parenting holistic approach, structural approach to really good parenting policy internationally, or any jurisdictions that have got some elements right, or even any communities where you're seeing really good examples?
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of the other things that we have done in this piece of research is there's 6 case studies that where families have been interviewed in other countries around the world and really asked about the things that make a difference for them. And it's very easy to point out the Nordic countries, and we do have a case study from Norway where, you know, they do have incredibly generous policies when it comes to paid parental leave and high quality early education and care, and the social norms about parenting are very different from here. But I would also say that Canada and Germany are 2 countries that I think are worth calling out. And one of the actually one of my colleagues at the Parenthood, Michael, he is actually German and he's married to an Australian, and they had their 2 boys in Berlin. And then when they had their youngest in Berlin, but they moved to Australia pretty much after she was born. Now, with both of their boys, they each had about 8 months of paid parental leave. They then both worked 4 days a week, which was completely normal. Both of their boys had access to fantastic early learning from, it was available really from 9 till 5, and it cost $200 a month. And the $200 a month was for the food, and the food was beautiful. And then, you know, they moved back here, and the culture shock they experienced when, you know, they live in Newcastle. So, you know, $150 a day is 1 day of early education and care. I mean, that's before the subsidy, but really when you put it into that context, and I think reading the German case study, knowing Michael's experience and knowing that that's a real life thing, that families over there, you know, in Australia, we are really putting mums and dads on very different tracks from the moment a child arrives. And we know that that actually makes life more difficult for each of those parents and for the children. Whereas when countries pursue, you know, the framework of thinking, well, parents have children and parents need to care, parents need to work, so let's look at how we can create the infrastructure to make that happen, it makes a really big difference. And I mean, that is one of the things that I think is sort of a positive sign. My view is, and, you know, when I wrote the forward to this report, I said, you know, we have got the answers. And we know some of the solutions that will make a really big difference. And that we can't pretend we're in a very fortunate position where we don't have to pretend we don't know how to fix these problems. We do know how to fix these problems, but we do need leadership, and we need a willingness to recognize these problems and recognize that solutions exist and that other countries pursue them. And the other thing that I would say is, when we landed as a board on the objective of wanting to make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent, we knew that that's quite audacious. But Australia has been world leading in things. We have been before, and you would have to say the way Australia has responded to COVID-19 is certainly among the world leading. We've had world leading outcomes. Now, there's a lot there that's very problematic that we could talk about, but I don't want to limit Australians into thinking we can't be the best in the world, because we could be, and the results would be very, very compelling socially and economically.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today, Georgie. Thank you for your advocacy on behalf of women, on behalf of parents. It's much appreciated. We've really enjoyed having you this afternoon, just to share a little bit of conversation and share the findings of that amazing report. Stay well, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We will see you again in a couple of weeks with another webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Penny. I really appreciate you for having me.
All good, Georgie. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgie, for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website with a link published to the weekly newsletter. Our next webinar will be Alexander the Young on May the 25th. Keep an eye out for our weekly newsletter for details. And thanks once again, Georgie, and to everyone who attended. Thanks and goodbye.